Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm just going to start doing some introductions and we will get started. So please welcome, you're welcome to this webinar on advancing rural women's economic empowerment through social protection and economic inclusion programs, which has been organized by STAR, by the FAO, and by Oxford Policy Management. My name is Lauren Phillips. I'm the Deputy Director of the Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division at FAO, and I'm really, really pleased to be here to talk about a topic which is highly relevant for all of us, but especially for the work that we do here in FAO. As I mentioned, the session is jointly organized, and it's the second of a three-part webinar series from STAR, which is entitled Empowering Change, Gender Responsive and Inclusive Social Protection Approaches for All. And I just want to mention that the next webinar will be on the 27th of November, so you can sort of keep saving the date until there is more information available online. Today's discussion is going to be very interesting. It's going to draw on the findings of a recent scoping paper, which has been published by the organizers on complementary social protection and economic inclusion programming for rural women's economic empowerment. I believe that my colleagues are going to post the link in the chat so that you can see it. And we're going to be exploring how multi-component approaches like Cash Plus, graduation, Asset Plus programs, and insurance are helping women to build income, assets, and agency across in stable and fragile contexts. And we're also going to be focusing on the available evidence about what works and why across different domains of economic empowerment, and reflect on how program design, delivery, and policy can translate into meaningful and lasting change for women and girls in rural areas. I'm going to briefly introduce all of our participants who are on today's panel, but before I do so, just a couple of points. The first is that this session will be recorded. It will be available online at socialprotection.org. You can use the chat box to introduce yourselves to fellow participants so we know where you're joining from. And we are generating automatic captions using artificial intelligence. You can click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen if you would like to have that. And finally, we invite you and encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to post any questions you have for the speakers, because we will make plenty of time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers with the speakers. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our colleagues who are here to present. First, I'm really happy that we have the lead researcher of the scoping paper, Maya Gavrilovic, here with us. Maya is going to guide us through the key findings of the paper and tell us a little bit more about the available evidence base on women's economic empowerment. And she's also going to help us to understand, the pathways for seeing change in projects, and provide us with a selection of policy and program design recommendations to get us thinking about how we can all design better projects that deliver social protection and economic inclusion programs. After Maya's presentation, we'll move on to our discussants. We have Michael O'Sullivan joining us, who's the lead economist and head of the World Bank's Africa Gender Innovation Lab. And Michael also has another colleague, Clara de la Valade, a senior economist at the Gender Innovation Lab, who's going to say for the Q&A session, as Michael unfortunately has to join another meeting. And we're also going to hear from Shalini Roy, who's a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Unit at IFPRI. And finally, we're very fortunate to have with us Bosta Tembo, who's a project officer for the Supporting Women's Livelihoods program of the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services for the government of Zambia. So I feel like I said a lot. Hopefully you're using the closed captions if needed. And I'm going to pass over to Maya, who has 25 minutes to present to us the paper. Maya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and nice, well, I can't see everyone, but good afternoon and good morning. I will be presenting, as Lauren has introduced, the findings of the scoping paper, or the narrative review of evidence that we have done over the past year, which is really looking at the linkages between what we call multi-component social protection and economic inclusion interventions, and the way they impact women's economic empowerment. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the motivation for research, next slide, thank you. I think we start with a kind of very well-known premise that rural women, particularly those who are dependent on agriculture and who are living in fragile settings, they continue to face multiple gender inequalities and different types of barriers. They really limit their potential for economic empowerment, from limited education, limited decision-making capacity, restricted access and control over the productive resources, and many other vulnerabilities and issues. And these barriers are really kind of preventing women from taking and expanding their economic and social opportunities. And given this, I think there is also an increasing global efforts to promote gender equality through integrated social protection and economic inclusion programs. Next slide, please. So our paper had several objectives, next slide, and a really broad scope, as you will see. I think one of the key objectives was to try and build an understanding of how a combination of social protection and economic inclusion measures, or again, what we call multi-component interventions, including agricultural insurance, in what ways they can facilitate women's economic outcomes in rural areas, and then try to kind of get an insight through what pathways these changes can occur. We also wanted to look at how design and delivery chain mechanisms support these outcomes, and again, the pathways through which the positive outcomes can happen. We sort of went a little bit broader, beyond just a program lens, to look at how these programs really are embedded and how they interact within broader environment, including the national social protection policies and systems, and what sort of implications this has for the scale up of the interventions. In addition to sort of looking at so-called regular sort of settings, we wanted to kind of get an insight into what these programs, what kind of impacts they can produce in more vulnerable conflict or fragile settings which are affected by the climate change. And then obviously on that sort of develop some practical set of programming recommendations for both policy and practitioner audiences. Next slide, please. Now, we have reviewed different types of multi-component interventions, but they all had in common the sort of focus, and the key objectives had to be economic or productive inclusion. So we looked at cash pass programs, which usually, as you well know, combine cash transfers with a range of measures, including productive assets, inputs, or technical training, to really enhance the livelihoods and productive capacities of poor and vulnerable households. We looked at graduation programs, which also kind of bundle these different types of productive inclusion measures with consumption support, but they're usually more strictly sort of time-bound and delivered in a sequencing in order to kind of move and exit people from poverty. In addition to graduation and cash plus, we also looked at asset plus programs, which combine agricultural inputs with productive inclusion measures with similar objectives, as well as agricultural insurance. Next slide, please. It's also important to sort of highlight, as I was saying, that we didn't want to strictly look at outcomes. We wanted to kind of see what role design, as well as the policy or the delivery chain mechanisms play in these dynamics. So we used the social protection system lens to assess the evidence, with a recognition that systems approach is really needed to address different elements for women's economic empowerment. Next slide, please. We try to sort of build as clear and as robust conceptual framing to kind of underpin our narrative review. And I'm sure many of you grapple with the concept of empowerment and economic empowerment in particular, and I sort of felt that it's quite a complex and multidimensional concept. We use the World Bank's definition of empowerment as the process of enhancing the capacity of individuals or groups to make choices and then transform those choices into desired actions and outcomes. Now, to become a bit more practical, we also relied on Naila Kabir's very well-known definition or the conceptual framework, which looks at empowerment through and interlinkages between resources, agency, and achievements. What is important to sort of highlight is that empowerment doesn't only emerge from having access or even control of resources, and really issues around power, issues around agency, and being able to actually, use and manage those resources in order to make, strategic decisions and choices is what really makes it impactful. In that sort of sense, empowerment for us also kind of adopted this broader framing, going beyond just economics and the financing, to look at the structural drivers of gender inequalities and the role of social barriers or discriminatory gender norms and practices, which also in a way had to be addressed to lead to effective outcomes. And finally, our sort of conceptualization of empowerment is, we were arguing that it's very important to sort of nail it or situate it within the sociocultural context, and in particular to try to see, how women within particular settings understand and define empowerment both as a process and as a set of outcomes. Next slide. We also developed a conceptual framework on the linkages between multi-component interventions and how these different types of programming, design features and delivery features, in what ways and through what pathways they really kind of lead to direct, intermediate, and final outcomes and impacts, and obviously the role of moderating factors. We don't have the time to go through the details, but I invite you to read the paper. Next slide, please. One of the important things for us was also to sort of map out on a hypothetical level, to sort of hypothesize, okay, what are the key pathways through which these interventions can actually facilitate positive outcomes. And we ended up with three main channels. The first one relies to the provision of economic transfers, which can really directly enable women to gain access to productive resources. And then it's assumed that women's greater control of resources in the household could really increase their relative bargaining position, leading to improved, for example, decision-making or well-being outcomes. The second pathway relates to the exposure to knowledge and skills, which might improve women's cognitive and socio-emotional ability, and that sort of helps them make more independent choices. And as a result, for example, women involved in farming might be more willing to adopt new farming technologies, which could lead to them expanding or diversifying their productive activities, or even transitioning into new occupations. And then the third pathway is looking at how women's participation in economic, or also known as self-help groups, can really enable them to gain access to resources. And then, how the participants who are exposed to group support, what that might do in terms of increasing their feelings of autonomy, self-confidence, and self-efficacy, leading to self-employment and other range of outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the specific outcome domains, we really had a very broad range, looking at more sort of traditionally, looking at outcomes which are more traditionally covered through impact evaluations, such as labor force participation, productive capability, to a certain extent, financial inclusion and decision-making. Next slide. And then we wanted to kind of expand the range to look at also psychological empowerment and gender attitudes, freedom of movement, time use, and collective agency. Next slide. Next slide. So what did we find out? Now, in terms of the labor force participation, I think overall the impacts on labor force participation and employment outcomes, we found that they are moderately positive, and they also vary across different types of indicators and settings. Now, outcomes for which multifaceted programs demonstrate strong positive effects include those related to an increase in women's paid employment and a higher likelihood of being self-employed. And there is less sort of strong evidence in terms of the work intensity, which is usually measured as increased or decreased hours of work or earnings. What was quite interesting, and one of the sort of key takeaways that was emerging from our assessment, is that there is quite a good evidence that multifaceted programs really enable poor rural women to shift from casual and often low-skilled and hazardous occupations to more productive self-employment. Another sort of interesting finding is that, even if you have positive effects in terms of the employment outcomes, there could be spillover effects, which might not be necessarily very positive on other outcome domains, like the mobility or time poverty. Next slide. In terms of the productive capability, I think this is one of the areas that where we found very positive effects on a range of outcomes for women and girls, including increased ownership of productive assets, increased investments in income-generating activities, diversification of livelihoods. And it really also looked like that in most of the cases, if women and when women increase their investments in productive assets and inputs, that really kind of enables them to expand their farm and non-farm business activities, which generally results in higher income. And in certain contexts, these effects usually persist for some time after the program exits. Next slide. Financial inclusion in terms of the body of evidence is more limited, but it generally points in a positive direction. And we found strong positive effects on personal savings, both in terms of improvements in saving practices and saving amounts, but less, limited evidence of changes, whether positive or negative, in terms of managing debt or loans or financial literacy. And self-help groups, which are usually formed through these types of programs, played a key function in fostering women's commitment and autonomy to accumulate savings, as well as, gave them the ability to better control and protect their resources from their husbands or other household members. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of decision-making, the evidence on women's decision-making and bargaining power was found to be quite mixed, again, with variations across programs and contexts. And programs generally led to more joint or shared decision-making and were less successful at shifting ultimate control over major economic decisions to women. And men typically retain control over major investment and economic decisions. Next slide, please. In terms of the psychological empowerment, Cash Plus and Asset Plus programs generally had a very positive impact on mental health, increasing the self-reported happiness and optimism, and also reducing symptoms of depression and stress. The positive effects were less prominent in the graduation type programs, while the impacts on intrinsic agency, which is often measured through indicators such as self-efficacy, self-worth, or aspirations, were less consistent. Now, gender attitudes, rarely, although I think this is becoming much more sort of an important topic in impact evaluations, but it's still, the evidence is limited, even though we are kind of having a very good understanding about the critical role that gender attitudes and norms play in moderating women's economic empowerment. But in terms of the impacts, programs have limited impact on shifting deep-seated gender attitudes unless they include specific and more intensive gender transformative components. Next slide, please. In terms of the freedom of movement, this is one of the least studied domains, and the impacts are highly context-specific. On a positive note, we have observed that greater control over resources and resultant increase in bargaining power usually improves mobility and bodily integrity. However, outcomes are complex, and as I mentioned before, sometimes increased economic activity, which kind of allows women to have better working conditions at home, for example, it can kind of reduce their mobility and freedom of movement. Next slide, please. In terms of the time use, impacts are quite mixed. We found that programs can increase women's total workloads. And this is to be expected because women often take on new or increased economic activities without a corresponding reduction in the unpaid care work and domestic work, which in many cases leads to time poverty and increased stress. However, some programs that explicitly address this issue through gender training have shown success in increasing men's participation in household chores, which also had a positive spillover effects on women's reduced workloads and even increases in time available for leisure. Next time, please. Next slide, please. In terms of the collective agency, we looked at two sort of sub-outcomes. Programs with self-help groups components usually improve women's social capital and group participation. And key drivers of participation in self-help groups, psychosocial and group gender trainings, and inclusion of community leaders that can make important difference. And then in terms of the political empowerment, again, programs have a generally positive impact, even though this is not a very sort of extensively studied outcome domain. Studies have found a rise in membership in community structures, women's enhanced ability to voice their concerns and participate in community decision-making, and in some cases, sort of increased likelihood of assuming leadership roles in the community. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the pathways of change and moderators, now in the literature, very few studies have actually looked empirically at pathways which contribute to women's economic empowerment, but we found some evidence for the following pathways. Now, the access to resources obviously does lead to women to accumulate savings, improve their income status and employment, but in most of the cases, this doesn't automatically lead to improvements or equal decision-making power. In terms of the knowledge and skills, training and coaching can lead to occupational change, particularly from casual labor to productive self-employment. And we also found that trainings, business or technical trainings, which combine life skills trainings, usually boost confidence and aspirations regarding the employment and productive activities. And then in terms of the group participation, sort of solid evidence that they promote financial inclusion and peer learning. They improve access to social capital and community influence. And they're also very powerful platforms for collective agency and resource mobilization. Next slide. In terms of the moderators, several factors have been found to determine the nature and magnitude of impacts on women's economic empowerment at the individual level. Conditions that usually predict success include pre-existing levels of education, skill sets and assets, as well as women's individual psychosocial attributes, as well as the preferences regarding the type of employment. At household level, the pre-existing endowments and conditions, including baseline economic status of household, prior asset ownership, labor availability, as well as intra-household gender dynamics, particularly the quality of spousal relationships, they really determine the magnitude of impact. And then at the contextual level, obviously gender and social norms, particularly norms around paid work, women's autonomy and ability to handle cash and division of labor have been most frequently cited as a key moderator of women's economic empowerment outcomes across contexts. Next slide. Now, there are some takeaways on design. One of the key sort of aspects that one of the key issues that it's actually explored in impact evaluations is this question around, is a full bundle necessary? Meaning, do you really have to combine as many pieces and components within these multifaceted interventions in order to achieve expected outcomes? And overall, I think a comprehensive package of measures is really required to address multiple constraints, and that bundling does improve impacts relative to the interventions in isolation, and this is not surprising. However, what was kind of surprising for me is that there is also emerging research, it's emerging, but it does show that a full package of measures may not always be necessary. And this really depends on the type of outcomes one wants to achieve. Now, a reduced number of components can produce a similar range of positive effects on women's labor market outcomes, savings, assets, and earnings. But then the fuller package of support appears to be required to achieve stronger impacts when it comes to women's psychological empowerment, decision-making, and political participation. Next slide, please. Now, just keeping on the same issue, the full versus reduced components, and then kind of trying to tease out which program components drive impact. There are several sort of exciting randomized controlled trials that have tested and compared the impact as well as the cost effectiveness of different component combinations to which are sort of necessary to create optimal results. And for example, the program supporting women's livelihoods program in Zambia compares, the RCT compares the full package, which includes productive cash grants, live business training, savings groups, and mentoring. And it compares the full package with human capital only component, which is focusing on life skills, business training, and mentorship, or the financial capital only, which only combines cash grants and savings group support, and obviously compares that with a control group. And then what the key sort of takeaway from that is there is no universal best package. The effectiveness of program components is highly dependent on the target's population-specific needs, the type of constraints and context, and tailoring the design and combination of measures is really essential for maximizing impact and cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. Now I'm running quite late, so we can just move. I have a couple of minutes left. Now, in terms of the design, other design considerations, it's very important that gender assessments are used at the beginning of the programming to identify women's barriers and opportunities, and then, according to evidence, design multi-component interventions according to women's needs, context, and environment. I think programs play well, but integrated approaches are needed to sort of go beyond just the program to address the root causes of gender inequality, particularly looking at how the programs can link women to markets and value chains, how they can address unpaid work and domestic work responsibilities, and then also tackle discriminatory gender norms and roles more directly. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, in terms of the delivery systems, one of the key things is really making sure that culturally sensitive outreach and communication and mechanisms are used, particularly on eligibility. And this is very important in multi-component programs which are run by different agencies. So women can actually enroll and participate in these plus activities. And leveraging data systems are also critical to improve targeting and coordination across programs, reducing duplication and optimizing resource use. But I think one of the realities is there is limited gender data and poor infrastructure, which often sort of hinders scaling up and effective targeting efforts and outcomes. Next slide, please. Next slide. And then in terms of the policy, I think and this is where our panelists can really share the insights. But it seems that embedding multi-component programs into social protection policies and strategic frameworks is really crucial for scalability and the long-term sustainability of interventions. But they're often sort of there are examples where this is happening, but yeah, in reality, most of the interventions are really pilot and small scale. And then scaling up and delivery of multi-component programs requires careful coordination across governments at different levels. And interinstitutional coordination is quite difficult to achieve in practice, and particularly when you add gender and women's economic empowerment objectives into the mix, that creates additional challenge. Another sort of interesting finding is that multi-component programs are expensive, but they, in most cases, cost-effective. One of the things that it's from a policy level missing at the moment is the analysis of the gender-responsive cost-benefit analysis, and this is, I think some of the recommendations where the evaluation and research should be moving forward. Thank you so much.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Maya. We really appreciate very rich presentation, and I'm sure that more questions will come up as we're going through and as people start to digest. I think we are ready to hear some reflections from our panelists who can help us to frame a little bit the very interesting and complex findings. So I'm going to pass the floor to Michael, who, as I mentioned, is the head of the Africa Gender Innovation Lab and a lead economist at the World Bank. So Michael, having seen the paper and now the presentation, what are your key takeaways? And can you explain a little bit why it's important in your view to invest in monitoring and evaluating women's economic empowerment along the lines of what we have in this paper?
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks, Maya. I don't know if my camera is showing my image, but that's fine.
We can't see you, but that's okay. We can hear you perfectly.
Yeah. So I guess I first want to thank the STAR team and the FAO teams just for inviting me to speak about this great scoping paper. I'm also glad to be joined by my Africa Joe colleague, Clara de Livelihoods, senior economist with our team, who's also our thematic leader for social protection. So I kind of wanted to talk first about the paper, and then thinking about our team's work at the Africa Gender Innovation Lab around building this evidence and getting it used, and sort of what the implications of this great work are for it. So, I mean, I think this is really an excellent and thorough synthesis of the policy evidence around women's economic empowerment in rural areas, and I won't be able to do justice to this work in the way that Maya just did, but it surfaced a lot of really important studies, including some that I hadn't seen before. And it strikes me just how much evidence exists in this space, but there's a paradox here that we know a lot, but we still have so much to learn, I think, around areas like time use, climate resilience, and of course, around these long-term impacts. And I think the paper also does an excellent job of really applying a rigorous lens to identifying causal evidence, but it doesn't stop there. It provides a good framework for analyzing the results and unpacking the how, the program design elements, the delivery mechanisms, those policy enablers. So, I look forward to seeing kind of what comes next from this work. I think there's a lot of scope to prepare shorter products, summaries and other kind of non-conventional ways to package and share this big body of evidence that is real relevance, including here at the World Bank. I want to share just about 5 reflections and try to keep within the time on sort of after having absorbed the paper. I think the first relates to cost effectiveness and scaling. Cost effectiveness is, I think, something that is underexplored in this review, and I think it's critical for scaling. But I recognize that women's empowerment doesn't necessarily lend itself to monetary indicators. But in a world of second bests, I think we can still try to proxy cost effectiveness estimates with indicators like women's own income or even standardized indices of empowerment. So there's this trade-off between extensive margin reach and intensive margin, pushes for transformational impact. But I think for us, a key question for policy is, what is that minimum viable package that we need to achieve not only those welfare gains, but also the empowerment gains? So there's still this perception in policy circles that economic inclusion programs are too expensive, they're too hard to put together, particularly in settings with kind of limited fiscal space. But I think, building this evidence base and also showing that cost effectiveness, those payoffs, is really going to be key. And I would add just, there are other non-monetary costs of evidence adoption. We know from the behavioral experimental literature that even the complexity and frictions associated with an intervention's rollout, even administrative processes and stuff, can also slow down its adoption. So, I mean, I think the evidence is showing us that more is not always better, and Maya pointed to this, the work our team has done and co-led with others in Niger on the ASP, the Zambia SWL, which it's great to have representation from Voster here today to talk about that. They've shown that basically there are ways to add more cost-effective approaches and get the similar impacts on the outcomes we're trying to move. The second area relates to measurement. I think this study and the sort of scoping paper made it very salient for me how we have a whole host of different outcomes and different ways of measuring them. And I think it's going to be important for all of us to try to converge around, a parsimonious set of outcome indicators that we can sort of use and compare across space. There's the ProWEA, which is really useful, I think, for agriculture space. There's work that we're doing with IFPRI, IRC, and others around Magnet, which is measuring domains like Women's Agency and others. Our Africa Jill team's been using a light touch instrument to sort of compare intervention impacts across sectors, but I think there's still more we could do on this front. The third area is around, trying to understand what explains some of these mixed findings. Why do we see this heterogeneity? And I think here it's real, context and implementation fidelity matter. So, the regional variation, even in the study, take the example of decision-making impacts. The systematic reviews point to how these impacts vary between sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and of course underlying norms and baseline levels of bargaining power can kind of address that. But I want us to think about another dimension, which is something that Maya pointed to, which is this lack of long-run impact measurement. Maybe it's that we're not also seeing the results manifest over time. And I want to give an example of the Zambia SWL Joule operation, where the paper cited in this review found no real impacts on decision-making power 1 year post-implementation. However, our team is now finalizing the 3-year follow-up impact paper, where we're finding that both the full package and the financial capital package led to positive and significant impacts on decision-making. So it shows that these gender norms are sticky, and we might need a longer time horizon. Maybe if we have time later, I also want to talk about implementation fidelity, which is another potential explanatory factor for some of these studies and interventions. It's not just the intervention itself, but how well was it implemented, particularly for scaling questions. On scope, maybe I'll Maya follow up with you later on some questions I have around why agricultural insurance and not other rural levers like land or asset titling, gender responsive extension, things like that. But I think that's it's a perfectly reasonable thing to include, but I think I'll end with the final point around climate adaptation. And I think there's, of course, a need for more evidence around this. And, I just want to emphasize that yes, climate smart agriculture is one of the potential adaptation strategies, but, our team, so Clara actually co-authored a new synthesis review around women and climate adaptation and assessing the constraints and drivers, and points to, off-farm adaptation and on-farm adaptation strategies, including things like income diversification and migration. So, income diversification itself is an adaptation strategy. But I think on the climate smart agriculture piece, this is an area where we're trying to really push the frontier. We're taking the Mauritania ASP Tekavul operation, and in its next phase, we're going to be testing a set of packages, including sort of climate-enhanced productive inclusion packages around seasonal planning and climate information. We're also going to test, again, sort of couples levels interventions to see to what extent we can address these overlapping constraints. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think you raised such interesting points now about the fact that there's still a need to make that business case or to sort of provide the cost benefit analysis so people can see the return on investment. And that includes both public and private sector actors, I think. But also, I think your point, it was really interesting about the sort of the long durée of the need to look at investments over a longer period of time, because it takes a long time to shift social norms, which is necessary to get some of the outcomes we're looking for. And so I was interested in the study you mentioned over in Malawi. That's great, Michael. And I know that you have to leave at some point, so thank you so much for being here. I think I'm going to pass next to Shalini. So having heard what Michael had to say and drawing on your work as a researcher with IFPRI, what do you think are the key contributions this paper can make to the literature on social protection and women's economic empowerment? And what factors can help governments really to invest more in a systems approach or a multifaceted approach to support these objectives? Over to you, Shalini. Thank you.
So thank you so much for this wonderful paper and presentation and for inviting me to comment. Like Michael, I'm also really impressed by this rich, expansive paper. It brings many contributions. It brings together pieces to create coherence where it's much needed, while also pulling apart complexity that I think often gets glossed over when there are attempts to summarize. It provides very thoughtful reflections on the way forward, concrete recommendations for both research and practice that helpfully range from more light touch and incremental to more ambitious and transformative, with the grounding in the evidence and clarity on how to actually try embedding these in systems. So I'll mention just a few points on these. In terms of contributions to bringing coherence across different topics, one example is simply the effort to bring together social protection and economic inclusion programming with rural livelihoods, with efforts to scale solutions for women's empowerment. Although it may not seem like they should be treated as disparate topics, they sometimes are. We sometimes see misperceptions that social protection is kind of an alternative to rural livelihoods. So it's only kind of providing resources for those who don't participate in livelihoods in the agri-food systems. And this either or view is, of course, not right. And this piece very nicely demonstrates the synergy for poor rural people. Social protection is often a facilitator to participating and strengthening their livelihoods. It provides the resource base for poor rural people to take advantage of economic opportunities. And the piece also makes very clear that the effectiveness, what happens, whether it goes beyond livelihoods to additional dimensions of economic empowerment, and importantly, for whom, really depends crucially on the design and implementation. And that particularly for poor rural women, resources are often necessary but not sufficient to address the multiple constraints they face to economic empowerment, thus the importance of the multiple components. I also like how it highlights what makes social protection systems a promising entry point for scaling rural women's economic empowerment. These are existing systems. They often already target poor rural women as primary participants. They often already recognize multiple barriers, and they show already success in improving some dimensions of women's empowerment. And so improving this existing system to do better for women is really a key opportunity for scaling women's economic empowerment. And then this is where I think, alongside the piece bringing pieces together, the paper's ability to also unpack the complexity is really valuable, because I think pulling apart how we understand women's economic empowerment really helps us to identify which dimensions kind of our standard designs are already generally effective on and where more is needed. And so, I won't recap the really helpful summary on which dimensions evidence is more promising on, where it's less, where it's still less clear. But just to say, some of my IFPRI colleagues have developed the Reach, Benefit, Empower, Transform framework to kind of organize thinking on how gender is considered in program, and considering programming. Is it simply reaching women? Is it going beyond to achieving material benefits for them? Is it actually empowering them? Is it truly transforming some of the root causes of gender equality? And I think the breakdowns here really help speak to that. It seems like the standard designs for, kind of in quotes, for multi-component social protection and economic inclusion programs seem to often reach, often benefit, sometimes empower in some dimensions. There may be some trade-offs across those dimensions, but that they need to be very intentional if they want to actually get to transforming. And I really like how the paper organizes these pathways and moderators to point to what may be the core features of packages that shape what it achieves for who and where. I particularly appreciated how thoughtfully the paper considers context. I think it's kind of a thing everyone says, that context matters. Excuse me, but the paper really tries to bring out concrete examples of how. And one of the examples the paper used is a study in rural Bangladesh that I was part of with BRAC colleagues and others. So I'll mention just a couple points around context from there. So that study was on the gender dimensions of the BRAC TUP Phase 2 graduation program in rural Bangladesh. And we know this graduation model has been very effective in reducing household poverty over quite a long term in Bangladesh and in many other countries. And in looking at gender, what we saw was that because of female seclusion norms in rural Bangladesh, and this is where the context comes in, prior to the program, poor rural women were working outside the home primarily out of economic necessity, largely in casual wage labor, as Maya said, which brought stigma and harassment. But when the program provided women with livestock and training and other components to productively maintain the livestock at home, it didn't increase their work per se, but shifted it from wage work outside the home to maintaining the livestock on the homestead. And this did give them ownership of the transferred livestock. But proceeds from the livestock, investments out of those proceeds into other assets, and so on, were largely still owned by men. And by women's work shifting to inside the home, their mobility outside the home actually decreased. We saw decreases in measures of women's decision making, their control over money. And so kind of on a lot of what we think of as like the quantitative metrics for empowerment, it looked like this had generally been bad for women's empowerment. And yet in qualitative work, women described the program as empowering. And they didn't speak to individual rights over assets, but to their ability to contribute to the household, to ensure their children were well fed, able to go to school, that they themselves had saris that they could wear to join community gatherings where they couldn't before because they didn't have the right clothes, and to not have to leave the home for work given stigma. And this kind of highlights a lot of interesting points around like what do women in the local context themselves consider empowering? And how do we think about what's kind of valid to view as empowering? So on one hand, women's views on empowerment are of course shaped by the norms in their context, and the gender roles and constraints they perceive. It was empowering to not leave the home because of the stigma. Individual ownership over assets may not be as meaningful when women don't have access to the relevant markets anyway. On the other hand, cultural context does shape how we view the importance of individual rights versus more communal. And we should be mindful of not kind of assuming or imposing kind of a universal viewpoint about how much women should care about the individual versus the communal. And then in terms of women valuing that they take care of their children, on one hand, this may reinforce traditional gender norms. On the other hand, of course, we need to value care. Sometimes it seems economists, not those involved in the scoping paper, but some find it kind of more valid for people to feel empowered by caring for a cow than caring for a human, right? Feeding a cow is a useful economic activity, but feeding a human is just a care burden. But I think we understand the issue with care is that it's unpaid work, and it's disproportionately borne by women, not that it's unimportant or something that you should not feel empowered by. And I think the range of related findings in the paper from this case study and others speak to the kind of current jobs agenda. Improvements for women may not mean more like hours of work, but better, more dignified work. We may need intentionality to see changes in mobility, gender roles. And there can be trade-offs across dimensions of women's economic empowerment. And then just some final thoughts on looking forward for governments, but also research that can better guide governments. I appreciated the highlighting that some of what we don't know is because we simply don't measure it. And just to mention that what we measure quantitatively, as a quantitative researcher myself, really needs to be thoughtful and ideally informed by qualitative research and deep understanding of the context. So, for example, when we want to understand how social protection can support women building more climate resilient livelihoods, which has been an interest of some governments and which IFPRI and the CGIAR and others have been working on, when we develop impact evaluations, we really need to first understand from women themselves what do they feel constitutes a livelihood that makes them more climate resilient in their local context, given what their risks are, what their opportunities are, and their preference are, and then try to analyze programs' influence on that. Specifically for governments, I really appreciated that there's such concrete recommendations, including how to prioritize depending on the setting and kind of noting that you can't always do everything and you may not need to, and that resources, expertise, capacity, political economy, core programming, all these things matter. I do think we want to give attention to prioritizing. We hear from social protection implementers that They sometimes feel we just kind of hang ornaments on the social protection Christmas tree, and we don't want to overburden programs in a way that compromises the whole program, right? We want to put resources and capacity behind any new components, not just spread thinner what's already there. We can also consider strategically tweaking existing components to do better. And this is particularly because emerging evidence is suggesting that, to Michael's point, weak implementation of a lot of things may just get us nowhere, not be kind of an inexpensive way to get what we hope for. And then also echoing Michael in terms of pitching this, and I know Maya described this nicely, I do find it helpful to note that making social protection multi-component and well implemented can deliver multiple wins. This is not a zero-sum game of, like we want to empower women, so we're going to have some losses for other household members or the broader economy. Very helpfully, it does seem that making social protection gender responsive makes impacts more sustained, stronger, broader for households, communities, overall economies. And I do agree that kind of putting together this gender responsive cost benefit analysis may be helpful for the pitch, not because we think women's economic empowerment isn't intrinsically important, but because we are increasingly asked for this business case. And here, if we can figure out the methodology to do it, there seems to be a solid case. So I'll stop there. Again, thank you so much for this great, useful work.
Thank you so much, Shalini. I think you raised so many interesting points. Let me just remind people what you started with is this is not an either or. It's not about either having people in productive rural livelihoods or social protection. It's about a mix of livelihood strategies. And I also really appreciated your examples on context and your points about valuing care work throughout. So I appreciate that. I think we're going to come back to the cost effectiveness question because I already see that in the chat, there's some questions about sort of, what are the trade-offs and thinking in this fashion. So we'll come back to that in the Q&A. But now I would really like to pass to our third panelist for his thoughts. Vostra Tembo, as I mentioned, is the project officer for supporting women's livelihoods in the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services in Zambia. Vostra, in order to help us understand what this means in practice, do you see similarities coming from the paper, from the evidence in the paper and what you see as key components in the program in Zambia? And what are the key factors that really help you to deliver the integrated program in Zambia that supports women's economic empowerment? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. To start with, what great piece of paper that has been summarized very well in a PowerPoint. And I think it brings out very rich information and actually very insightful in terms of looking into what we are implementing, for instance, in Zambia. And of course, it brings out a lot of similarities of what is coming out of SWO and also from the evidence that has been prepared. To start with, when you look at programming, already the paper talks about the importance of cash plus and supporting women's livelihood in Zambia is a cash plus model where the project targets those that are already on social cash transfer. And then it targets women that are coming from the social cash transfer households that qualify to be on the supporting women's livelihood. And it's able also to give them a multi-component approach, as already indicated in the paper, where we are able to provide trainings in life and business skills. And also we're able to expose these women to groups in saving groups where they're able to come together and be able to save even way before they even get the productivity grant. So in that manner, it's able to provide a sense of ownership, I think, from the perspective of the women. And also this brings us back to the conversation that the point that Shalini just indicated of context, that even when we are training the women in life and business skills and providing them with the productivity grant, they are able to make a decision on their own on which productive economic activity that they will need to engage. So the project really does not impose what kind of an economic activity that the women need to engage in, but they they start their businesses based on the context of the area where they're coming from. And mind you, these are women that are coming from rural areas and extremely excluded women in terms of economic participation. And the project is able to target those and be able to take them through these processes of life and business skills, and also putting them into saving groups, so that even when they are able to get their productivity grant, they're able to invest the money into something that will be very productive, not just for themselves, but for their family and the community as a whole. Also, Maya, when she was presenting, I think brought out some positive effects of women economic empowerment. And those that are pretty much similar to the ones on SWA, or just pick on a few. She spoke of increased ownership and control of productive assets, and also increased investment in income generating activities and diversification of livelihoods. So these, in comparison and the similarities to SWL, the recent results from the impact evaluation of SWL did point out that there was increased asset livelihood at a household level, and that increased assets increased by 24%. There was an increase in income by 62% at a household level, and also there was an increase in savings by these women that were participating in the saving groups and that participated on the program. So all in all, in terms of similarities, you find that actually the paper is quite bringing out quite a lot of evidence that are pretty much similar to those that have been seen on the ground under SWL. But in terms of what are the key factors that help us to deliver this integrated program for the government, the most important thing to start with, I think, it's coordination. As you might be aware, the program is not only being supporting women's livelihood is part of the broader JUO project, which is being implemented in the Ministry of Community Development, Ministry of Education, and also Ministry of Health now, but being coordinated by the Gender Division, which sits under the Office of the President. So in that line, it entails that there has to be a well coordinated mechanism to ensure that the project is able to deliver, because it does not just focus on community development, but there are other players that that participate to ensure that the program is implemented successfully. I'll give you an example. Within the Ministry of Community Development, there's a component of social cash transfer and also supporting women's livelihood. So to start with, we work hand in hand with the Department of Social Cash Transfer to ensure that we have access to their database. And through that database is there where we filter in our categorical criteria to be able to see who qualifies to be on the supporting women's livelihood. But not only that, it also filters down into the districts where the implementers are, and to be able to see that both the social welfare department and the community development department, where SWO is sitting, are able to work together to be able to validate these names on the ground and to be able to ensure that the targeting and enrollment of beneficiaries is done correctly. And for it to be done correctly, again, it goes back to the community leadership that have to buy into this concept of empowering women. As you may be aware, in most rural areas, women are not really given that much space of empowerment. And in order to achieve this, you need to get a buy-in from the traditional leadership, from within the community. And by design, deliberately, supporting women's livelihood in the training manual for life and business skills, we were able to invite men as well in some of the sessions, men into the trainings, so that even as women are able to go for this particular training for 21 days, an hour or two a day, they are not received back home with resentment of where they have been pretty much the whole time, instead of taking care of the family at home. So we invite a male figure within that particular household to be able to attend some of these trainings, so that they are able to understand exactly what the program is all about and what the what the effect would be on their household and also on their community. So in a nutshell, traditional leadership is important. Working with line ministries and other departments in a well coordinated manner is actually very key to deliver such a program, but also to be able to understand that the women themselves need to make a decision on what kind of program, economic activities that they need to engage in instead of imposing a one-size-fits-all some sort of an activity. But what has come out more clearly is that women coming together and to be able to save together in the saving groups has really increased their incomes at household level and also at a community level. And then SWO has moved in now to ensure that the funds that these women are saving is secured and now moved from the traditional saving boxes into the digital saving boxes, because we have seen that the funds are growing from an example of maybe some women are saving as much as $2,000. So that huge amount of money poses a risk on some of these women. So now we are transitioning into the digital savings, but also in closing, the project is able to give women a voice through the grievance redress mechanism that the Supporting Women's Livelihood has put in place, where women are able to air their concerns and grievances, not only directly or particularly to the project, but things that have to do with GBV, things that have to do with any other issues that are affecting their community. They're able to voice out through the grievance redress mechanism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for telling us about all of the interesting and complex facets of the program, and for thinking so carefully about things like how to reduce pushback and include men in the trainings, how to ensure that women are safe and that their savings don't create problems within their communities, and for sort of giving us a sense of the targeting and the breadth of the program. I really appreciate that. We have time for questions, in fact, and we do have some questions in the Q&A tab. So let me start with a question from Maya, which is there, and if the colleagues from the panel and Maya want to turn back on their cameras, they're welcome to do so. So there is a question from Julie Lawson-McDowell asking if you have thoughts on design complexity versus capacity for implementation. And she's put an example there on Zambia and talked about while the ambition to multiply impact is understandable, is this leading to compromises? And I think it would be great if Maya starts with this and then maybe Voster can come in afterwards.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Julie, for I think a critical question that Michael has already sort of started to talk about, the fidelity of implementation, which I think it's absolutely critical. And it was, emphasized in many of the studies and the narrative reviews, that obviously because we have the complex designs, we have multiple activities, the issue around the capacity, the institutional arrangements that are in place to deliver these very time and resource intensive activities, they do, the evidence does show that they can either improve or undermine the effects. And I think Sustainable Livelihoods initiative in Zambia is one of the examples. I think there are a couple of things relating to this fidelity of design to implementation. Obviously, the insufficient human resources, staff capacity to deliver gender responsive provisions and activities. In many cases, there are no resources in place to train the staff in gender responsive or gender transformative methodologies. Obviously, the inadequate budgets, do they have basics in place to kind of deliver these complementary activities, trainings, coaching, mentoring. And then another sort of drivers that affecting the fidelity and the quality and the consistency of the implementation, it's obviously complex operating environments. So those sort of factors have been found to lead to uneven, low quality, and also sort of delayed delivery of the PLAS activities. And this was especially the case for training, coaching, and mentoring, which, you know, on another level was actually found to be like an X factor, like a very positive sort of feature, design feature that is improving and enhancing outcomes, but it's very time and resource intensive, and often, you know, there is kind of an inconsistency and poorer quality of delivery, which impacts the outcomes. But there are some sort of considerations, you know, how these issues can be addressed in practice. You know, one of the things, for example, that is coming up is, you know, thinking around whether whether the coaching and the mentoring needs to be delivered in all of the settings and for all of the programs individually at a household level or at the group level, which is easier to sort of implement. And what the evidence is currently showing, it's also cost effective. You know, it's kind of transitioning to digital modalities also in delivering some of the coaching and mentoring, but also, you know, different modalities in terms of the institutional arrangements. You know, in some countries, there is a higher reliance on government staff to deliver these PLAS components, but in, you know, certain settings, maybe the ability and agility of NGOs or the private sector can step in and kind of complement the delivery. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Maya. We might come back to you, but let me just see if Voster wants to add anything about that from his perspective in the context of Zambia, about the sort of trade-off of complexity and implementation challenges.
Thank you once again. Maya has elaborated very well, but I'll just give a brief conversation in terms of how Zambia has been able to tackle some of those. And of course, she's absolutely right when we talk about issues that have to do, for instance, in training, because this has to be done by the community-based volunteers that are identified by the districts. But you discover that actually that would do the training, would train the district staff that would need to train the community-based volunteers. And it is that space when the community staff train the district staff train the community-based volunteers, and the community volunteers, when they now go and train the beneficiaries, there was a notice that there was a knowledge loss in some of the districts, and also in terms of knowing exactly what has to be delivered in the districts by the community-based volunteers, because these have to be done in a local language. So that translation of the training materials from English into the local language, and by community-based volunteer who is able now to conduct those trainings in that particular local language within that particular community, sometimes is that there was that knowledge loss. But also, it's one of the positive things that I think has come up by which SWO is using is that there's a project implementation unit at the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services. And it's from there that the rest of the districts in all 116 where we are going now, we rely so much on government staff. So it's now being able to identify the government staff within those particular districts that are able to work with SWO and attached to SWO, but they're on government, they're government staff, but they're attached to SWO as a project to be able to identify them as master trainers. The challenge also which comes with that is that there's always movement of people being transferred from one district or one office to the other in government. So again, that creates a bit of a challenge. Overall, we have identified a pool of trainers that are able to train community-based volunteers, and these community-based volunteers will be able to train the beneficiaries in life and business skills in the language of that particular community. And maintaining that pool of trainers is important to ensure that there's continuity and consistency. And that's the reason why in each and every community where these women are coming from and where the project is being implemented, working through the traditional leadership, they're able to identify themselves to indicate that this is a person who has been a volunteer under the Ministry of Health or under the Ministry of Education. And we use pretty much those pretty much the same volunteers once identified that are able also to deliver those trainings to the beneficiaries in the community. So yes, it's important to acknowledge that there are those complexities when it comes to delivery and implementation, and also even on targeting, because the targeting, we do the basic filtering of knowing who should be, of determining who can be on the program. But when we get into the ground now, there has to be a verification of those particular households. There has to be a simple self-registration process. There has to be a community validation and a lottery process if the quota of that particular community is more more than the allocated number that needs to be. If there are more people that need to be that have qualified to be on the program compared to the quota, so we need to do a community validation and lottery. And it is at that particular time that if it is not handled well, you could actually have a lot of problems, and that's where community leadership and traditional leadership come in to ensure that the process is well done and managed by the government staff also, and the traditional leadership as well. Thank you.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. There's a couple of other questions that I want to make sure that we get to. So I think I'm going to go back to Clara and Shalini. So there's a question about cost effectiveness. And the question is, do you have concerns about placing too much emphasis on cost effectiveness, which could lead to programs focusing on easier to reach groups and overlooking the most marginalized? So that's the sort of first question that I would like to ask. Maybe Clara can start, and then Shalini, I want to come to you on another question as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, that's a very important concern and question, and I agree that we certainly don't want cost effectiveness, or the goal of cost effectiveness to mean excluding the hardest to reach populations. But so what we've learned from the JIL evidence is that cost effectiveness is very related to how well programs tailor delivery to the context, much more than depending on targeting only the easiest groups. And so, for instance, in the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program that Maya mentioned, even extremely poor, I'm thinking about especially its implementation in Niger, even extremely poor, low literacy women benefited when psychosocial and community components were adapted to their realities. And so, in that case, it was a group-based intervention in local languages delivered through government systems. And so here, the psychosocial arms ended up being as effective as the capital arms, but at much lower cost, precisely because they were able to meet women where they were. And so I think here, key lesson is that engaging men and local leaders and the broader community can actually make inclusion both more effective and more affordable. And and so when we're able to facilitate discussions around the constraints that women face, and when men and the whole community is engaged in these discussions and in identifying local solutions, it helps reduce resistance, increase cooperation, and actually amplify impacts of graduation programs without major extra costs. And so actually improving delivery mechanisms for an intervention that has proven effective and inclusive can make it more cost effective and more scalable, and actually allow us to reach populations who might otherwise be left out, more marginalized populations. So in the end, our experience is that cost effectiveness and inclusion aren't mutually exclusive, but actually balancing the two requires us to focus on adapting and improving delivery mechanisms that again truly enable women's participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. Shalini, can I pass to you?
Yeah, so I would agree. I think this is a really, I think there's a lot of, particularly with this constrained funding environment, a lot of focus on what's the biggest bang for our buck we can get. And I think we recognize that that puts a very real risk of just going for like the easier wins. I guess my view of cost effectiveness is maybe a few points on that. One, I would not say that we should do only what's cost effective, but highlight that there are some aspects of this that lend itself to cost effectiveness. So along the lines that Clara is describing, and also that I think sometimes there is a sense that doing things that are gender responsive is going to be like a, you know, okay, well, we're making it gender responsive. Does that mean we're going to do less on poverty reduction or food insecurity or malnutrition? And I think the fact that, again, helpfully, the evidence shows that there's a lot of complementarities across these and synergies across these, helps to make the case for cost effectiveness because it does mean that what you're doing here is going to strengthen, broaden, possibly sustain benefits better than if you didn't. The other is that I think there are different ways of thinking about cost effectiveness. I think there's certain methodologies or certain kind of approaches that would kind of frame this more as like cost consequences. So for this amount of cost you put in, what do you get for it? And while there are certain outcomes that are very hard to translate to things like dollars, GDP, DALYs, whatever, you can still talk about like for this investment that we put in, we reduce, for example, child marriage was the example, right? We reduce it by this amount. And so you can kind of speak to things that may be a little harder to quantify in dollars. And again, I think my view is not that we should do this only because it's cost effective. We should, take these efforts because they're cost effective. But unfortunately, we're kind of under pressure to make this case increasingly to a lot of governments and donors.
Thanks so much. Let me just add to a part of a question that was also asked on beyond doing impact evaluations, which is how we're going to get at the kinds of answers we were just talking about now. What about having consistently conducting complementary process evaluations, looking at user experience, the delivery chains, et cetera? I don't know if Shalini, if you want to come in that, and then Clara, you can feel free to add as well.
I mean, I would basically just completely agree with that. I think it's incredibly important, particularly when we're talking about something that is so contextualized. First, the implementation fidelity is clearly incredibly important in everything. You can have the most beautiful design, but if it doesn't play out in the implementation, you're not going to see the fruits of that. And so you do need to continuously monitor. But then also on the front of trying to understand what we should be measuring in an impact evaluation, I think those process evaluations and kind of qualitative work and just close engagement with everyone on the ground can be really informative for, again, just like an example of like, what is building climate resilience? Like, what does climate resilience mean for women in that context? It's like a very important thing to understand before you try to figure out what you're quantitatively going to measure. So I fully agree.
Perfect. Clara, do you want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add that I agree with all that was said. I also want to add to the point on cost effectiveness on Shalini's important point of, a key, when we talk about cost effectiveness, I think it's important to have in mind that we don't want to focus on economic outcomes, and especially when we talk about women's empowerment. No, so the way we're approaching cost effectiveness is, okay, let's see how we're best able to move all these different kinds of outcomes. And essentially, when we're talking about women's empowerment is, in the context of social protection programs is, okay, let's see which component or which delivery mechanisms are able to help us move not only women's economic outcomes and profits and revenues and income, but also move their agency, their decision-making power, reduce their, time spent on household chores, improve cooperation within the household, reduce gender-based violence, and, all these dimensions that matter for women's empowerment. And again, cost effectiveness analysis is also paying attention to that. And yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Maya, I think I just want to turn it over to you to sweep up any questions you want to respond to. There were some questions about targeting strategies, which Voster touched a little bit on, but I just give you the floor to make some final comments on any of the things that interested you in that conversation. Please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this has been so rich and incredibly insightful. The issue around targeting, I mean, that's like a, it's a long-standing issue, and I might not talk about the sort of grievances at the community level or across the households, but what was quite interesting again from the paper is, so it's not only the grievances and these kind of feelings of unjust targeting between the households or different sort of groups within the community, but also a lot of grievances and a lot of backlash and resistance of women who are participating, beneficiaries and participants in these plus programs, experiencing resistance from their husbands, from the family members or different groups. So just thinking about targeting in a broader sense and the grievances in the broader sense was really coming up as one of the important issues, which was not only kind of presenting a constraint or a barrier for women to participate and take part in these complementary activities like training, etc., but also obviously impacting the uptake of benefits, whether it's knowledge, etc. And then, what you would kind of do to address those grievances in regular programs or when it comes to sort of those more traditional issues. One of the sort of important measure was these kind of community consultations events. And I think Claire was mentioning, and this was really coming up very strongly in the case of Niger, the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program, which really played a kind of key role, bringing together different members of the community, including, households, partners, mothers-in-law, village leadership figures. And this kind of really was important to create this platform where these gender backlash and the concerns could be raised through specific sort of participatory and most importantly kind of context-tailored methodologies to reduce the resistance and to, kind of prepare the rationale and raise the awareness of why it's important to target women for the complementary interventions and what, the households, families, and the broader community can really gain from that. And that seemed to play an important role in the overall impact.
That's so useful. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to bring the session to a close unless any of the colleagues from the panel want to make a final intervention. If you do, just shout, please. Otherwise, I wanted to say that there's a remaining question about accessing the presentation after the webinar is over. And our colleague Bilal wrote into the chat that the presentation and the recording will be sent to all registrants in a follow-up email and be available on the sp.org webinar page after the session. And there's a link there. So hopefully everyone who is very interested and wants a copy of the PPT will be able to find it. And I think with that, we've really answered all the questions that were raised, and we're really grateful, especially to our speakers, Maya, Michael, Shalini, and Voster, and Clara, who helped us with the Q&A, for being here, for sharing their thoughts and perspectives, and for sharing the paper. And I really do encourage you all to read the paper, which, as you've heard, is very rich. And then I also, as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, the final webinar in this series is going to take place on the 27th of November. Please do register to join that session. And I really appreciate you all spending the time with us this afternoon, this morning, or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you all. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.